to show you how to make a Metis boulettes. Boulettes? I hope I pronounced that right. The French in me is not very French today. And that's a meatball soup. I did not realize that I had a culture. I just thought we did. We ate and we sang and all of that stuff. But it is the Metis culture. When I was asked to do a Metis meal, I did a little bit of research and I realized that we did actually have it a lot growing up, and my grandmother did make it for us. I don't remember my mom making it, but I do remember my grandma making it. And it was yummy, and it was nutritious and made from very little. The research that I did do on it brought me back into about the 1930s, and it was when the Métis people were in a terrible economic slump, so there wasn't a lot of extras. This soup was made with literally bare bones, basics, and it was made as a celebration meal on New Year's Day. The ladies of the households would make the broth and make the soup from the broth, and then they would have an open house on days like New Year's Day and other celebrations, and the open house would allow any of the friends and families to come and visit and wish a Happy New Year, and they would visit and share stories and share the things that they'd missed while being apart, because they did very often live very far apart, and they also didn't have the best transportation at that point in time either. And the younger people would receive a blessing for the year from the elder male in the household. So that was also part of the open house, for the younger people to receive that blessing so that they could go into the new year and with good fortune. So the first thing we're going to do is make a bone broth, which is a process that takes about 12 hours for the really yummy stuff. You can shorten it up, but you don't get as much flavor. So we will start with the bone broth. If you do not want to do a bone broth, you can just use the beef broth that you buy from the store, but I'm telling you, it's got nowhere near the taste. And I thought for this experience that I'm sharing with you, the bone broth process would be a really good part of it. So during the time around the early 30s to the 40s, when this particular soup was really popular, the Métis people were economically challenged and economically hurting. So it was made with the absolute essentials that they had kicking around in their house. The bison and the buffalo at that point in time were almost extinct for them, and so beef is what they generally used. In older times, buffalo was used, but so today we're just going to use some beef bones. And I've already got them in the oven because it is such a long process. So, and it is time to flip them. So I am going to take you over to the oven. So we're at the 1 hour point with the bones in the oven at 400. And now what we're going to do is we're going to flip them, and we're going to throw in some onion, 2 cups of diced onion, which is roughly 2 smaller onions, and we're going to put in 1.5 cups, which is roughly 2 large carrots, into the bone broth. So we'll flip these very carefully. Get a bit of a facial here. It feels lovely. And this is roughly 6 pounds of bones. And this will make you about 16 cups of stock. So I have got here my onions, and I've pre-cut them for this video, or for this purpose only. Oops. And then my carrots, which is about 2 cups, and again I've pre-cut those, and the other half will be for the actual soup. And that's it. That'll go in for about another half hour, 45 minutes, and after that we will flip the bones again at that point and paste them with tomato paste and let them cook for a little tiny bit longer. Now that these bones have been in for an hour and a half, we are gonna flip them again. Maybe, if you can see what I'm doing. We're gonna flip them again. Give these veggies a little bit of a stir when we flip them. And again, they're on still at 400. Oh, that one doesn't want to flip. All right, and we're gonna brush them with a little bit each of tomato paste. And that'll just give them a yummy little bit of a tangy taste to the broth. And this is, oh goodness, I'm trying to remember. It's about, you'll use about 2 ounces of tomato paste. So half of a little can to do these. Now what you want to do is leave them in for about another half hour or until they're brown. So we'll just set the timer for about a half hour and check them. It's usually about a half an hour, 40 minutes. What I'm going to do now is take these really yummy looking bones. You can see that they're nice and brown, so the tomato paste got nice and brown on them. And I'm going to take these bones, and I'm just going to lift one up, and you can see there's still some marrow and stuff inside. That's where most of your nutrients are. And I'm going to put them in the big stock pot, and we are going to boil them. And our big old bones are gonna go in this stock pot. See, this one, you can really see there's still lots in there. We want to get every single ounce of nutrients that we can get out of these bones. I have to remember that in the day of the original Métis, that they were living hard lives, hard physical lives, and they needed all the nutrients that they could get. Now I'm just going to cover what's in this pan, and when I say that they used absolutely everything, I'm just covering the vegetables in this pan with just tap water, and I'm going to put it on to boil a little bit, and just to get everything out of the bottom of the pan before we take and dump it in with the bones. So we'll just let that do its thing for a minute. So what you want to do is, with a spatula, of some sort. I'm just using this one. You want to get everything off the bottom of the pan. So we want to scrape up every bit of food that we can get to go back into that stock pot to make our broth. Pro tip, this makes cleaning this pan so easy. So we have brought this on the stove to a simmer to make sure that we get everything off the sides and the bottom. And now it is ready to go into the big stock pot. So just making sure we got it all. I got the stove turned off. And we will put that into the big stock pot with the spice bag. All right, so we've got this yummy looking stuff. It sure smells good. Yum. And I can smell that tomato paste. We are going to just dump it into the pot. Ouch, hot. Very hot. Alrighty. So we're going to make a spice bag to go into the bone broth, to boil with the bone broth. Now what I'm using is just bags for loose tea. And I find that they work fantastic. I use them in a lot of my sauces and whatever I'm making, and then I staple them shut. So I'm going to take about 5 or 6, that was kind of yucky. These ones are little, so I've got 6, maybe we'll throw 7 in there. Cranberries just purchased from the store. My grandma would use juniper berries, or she would use the little cranberries that we pick in nature, in the woods or wherever we might happen to be, and she would dry them very often. So what I did is I just squished them with a little jar and in the bottom of this bowl. I'm going to put them in my little tea bag here. Oops. And I am going to take and do the same with a half a teaspoon of black peppercorns. We'll squish them up and put them in the bag. When I was a little girl, she lived in a community, a small community that had your regular iconic general store, like you see in the movies these days. It had the cafe counter in the back, and the pie cooler, and the swivel stools and all that stuff. And they had the just like Little House on the Prairie. It's that little general store. They had the bulk stuff that you could buy in the back, and she used to buy her spices in bulk, and she'd get them in little brown paper sacks. And again, just using what I have. I'm sure proper equipment would make things a little bit easier, but today we're using what we have. So I just put this in the bag. And so that's a half a teaspoon of the dry peppercorns. And we're going to do a sprig of rosemary. This one's really big. If you're using fresh basil leaves, then you want 4. These are pretty tiny. Dry, you only need 3, but or 2. I'm gonna stick 3 in there because they're pretty small. And then a half a teaspoon of the thyme. And you can use fresh thyme as well. I just couldn't find any. So, and the same with the juniper berries. I could find no juniper berries because that would have given a more authentic taste. But I couldn't find any. And so we've got our three sprigs of parsley that again I had already trimmed down just to save on some time. And stick that into this little bag and staple it shut, and it's ready to go into the broth to simmer away for a little bit. And we've got our spice bag, and we're gonna drop that in there. And we have got 2 good long stalks of celery that's just cut up, just sliced up. That's gonna go in there. And then we're gonna fill this up with 12 cups of cold water. And we're back. I am going to add a little bit, if I can open the jar, of kosher salt. I am going to do 3/4 of a tablespoon, or teaspoon, sorry, so that's 3/4 of a teaspoon. And about 1/4 of a teaspoon of just regular black pepper. And that's gonna go in there. And we are going to simmer this for a half an hour, and then we'll check on it. This will simmer for another hour after that at a medium boil. That's how we were gonna simmer that. And then after that, it will simmer, turned very low. It will simmer for about 4 hours. And by very low, when you look in the pot, it'll be like a bubble or 2. And then we will check it. We will add 2 more cups of cold water, icy cold water, and then we'll let it sit and do the same for 6 hours. So this is 12 hours later, and our soup has been, or our broth has been simmering, and this is what it looks like. The first step to draining this broth is to remove these huge bones. And there's 4 in there. And they're heavy. I know some happy puppy dogs. Chuckles here is going to be really happy, and my other grand puppy dog will be happy, Coda. And my puppy dog, Jakey, will be very happy. So here's the bones, all 4 of them, all 6 pounds of them. Here's my little spice bag. We'll take that out over here too. Now, like I said earlier, nothing is wasted. So these bones would go to the dogs. So we've started to drain the broth into the cheesecloth, into the bigger pot. And you can see all of the little things floating in there that this should give us a clear beef broth. And you can store this beef broth into, or this bone broth into, or sorry, in the fridge for up to 3 days, and you can freeze it for up to 3 months. You can use this for anything that you would use a beef-based broth for. Stews, anything, gravies, anything that you would want to use a beef broth for. You can use any kind of bones. I don't remember my grandmother using pork bones. I remember beef, and I remember poultry. So it might be kind of fun to try this with your turkey carcass after Thanksgiving this year. Chicken, the chicken and the turkey, you will probably want to cook them a little less time because they are not as big, so it takes less time for them to cook. So I believe what I read was cut 2 hours off of the cooking time for the simmering time for the poultry bones, and a half hour out of the oven. So you should get out of this batch of bone broth about 16 cups. So, and again, you can freeze it up to 3 months, and you can store it in the fridge for about 3 days. I just stick it into Ziploc bags, Ziploc freezer bags when I freeze it. Now this is the strainer, and again, that would not have been wasted. That would have gone out to the pigs or the dogs or something back in that day. But I do not have a use for it, so unfortunately it's going into the trash. And this is what my broth looks like. There's a little bit of oil on the top, and I'm gonna try to skim it off. And this is not the best tool in the world to use for skimming, but it's all I had. And back in the day, they really used what they had. I'm gonna take this bad boy over to the stove, and we're gonna throw some onions and some carrots in, and we're gonna bring it to a boil. So the rest of the carrots, 2 large carrots are going in. And again, I had those pre-cut. And the onions. So a half a cup of onions go into the stock. And we'll bring that to a boil. And then we will put a spice sack in there as well. And we will add the potatoes, and we will add the celery at that point. So we leave this uncovered. While that is boiling on the stove, I am going to make my spice sack to go into my broth, and it's exactly the same spice sack as, that is going into my soup. It's the same spice sack that went into the broth. So what I've got here is about 5, what do I got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're pretty big. They're pretty big. I don't know if you can. Store-bought cranberries. When I was a kid, my grandma we would go and we would pick them in nature, and she would call them Canuck. I don't know if that's a Cree word, and I don't know if that's or if it's a French word. But we would collect them. She would dry them. She put them in all kinds of things, fresh and dried. A lot of it in her meats, which is a very Métis thing, and maybe someday I can show you how to make mincemeat pies, and which a lot of the dried fruit went into as well. Now what I'm going to do is squish these just like that. Now the wild cranberries are tiny, like little teeny tiny berries. So you would use, if you were using wild ones, you would use way more. So I'm just gonna stick these in the sack, in the spice sack. A sprig of rosemary is going in there. 3 stalks of parsley, which I just grabbed at the grocery store, and they're pretty tiny, so we'll just, and I already trimmed them up, so we'll just stick those in there as well. And we're gonna do 2 bay leaves, dried bay leaves. If you're using Actually, I'm going to stick one more in for good measure because they were kind of tiny too. If you're using fresh, which you can do, then you want to use 4. I have some thyme leaves. How do you say it? I don't know. Half a teaspoon. And we use the fresh rosemary leaves. So I'll put the dry rosemary leaves in there, and then we're going to do a half a teaspoon of black peppercorns. And again, my wonderful method of squishing things. And again, they would use whatever they had to work with. Kind of noisy. Then I'm going to put that into the sack. And throw it into the pot of soup. And then we will work on meatballs to go in the soup. Just got the bags for loose tea, and that's all I use for any of actually my soups and stuff like that I make. Let's put this into the bag. A couple of them never got squashed. And then I kind of cheat. I figure, hey, it's not the end of the world if I'm using a tea bag with a staple in it and water. So I staple my bag shut and throw it into the pot. Alrighty, we've got about 1.5 pounds of hamburger here. We are going to make some meatballs, and we will add about 1/2 cup of onions that are supposed to be finely chopped. I've never been really good at finely chopping. More like a chunky chopper. So now I'm going to add a 1/2 teaspoon of dried rosemary leaves. Well, maybe a little bit more because I think I have a little bit more hamburger than what is called for. And the same with the thyme. Half and, I don't know, a little bit. And I do apologize for those that are used to precise measurements. My granny was a pinch of this, a pinch of that, and that's who I learned most of my basic cooking from. So we'll mix all this up. And again, you could use any ground meat, but trying to stay true to the cultural meal, I use beef. My grandmother could cook anything out of anything, always. And wasted absolutely nothing. So then we're supposed to get about 12 meatballs out of this. I think we might get a tiny bit more. So we're supposed to quarter this and then quarter it. I think we'll probably get a little bit more than that. I didn't use quite all of those I'm just gonna go check the stove, see how our broth is coming along. We've got a nice little rolling boil happening over there. And I mean, if you want to make smaller meatballs, that's fine too. So here I am just forming my meatballs. If you have, if your hamburger or your ground meat isn't sticking together really well, you can add a little bit of water. And then what I'm doing, this is just flour, just rolling it in flour. The Metis people, and I'm going to use my grandma as an example, wasted nothing, absolutely nothing. Even the bacon grease, the grease off of the meats, a lot of the meats that they used was saved into a tin can. And I can remember my mom and my aunts and my uncle talking about taking their bacon grease sandwiches to school. And they loved them. Bacon grease sandwich. And I remember even as a kid, my grandpa and my grandma, not so much my grandma, but my grandpa for sure. And my mom, when she would go home, that would be a treat to have a bacon grease sandwich.
So explain to me what in the world a bacon grease sandwich is, because I just can't picture it.
Bacon grease, just when you cook your bacon, you drain your bacon grease into a can and let it harden.
Where it gets that sort of orangey, pasty.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then they would just smear that on a piece of bread like peanut butter. So while this is taking me some time to roll out these meatballs, I have a little story about my grandma and my grandpa and not wasting food. My grandma and grandpa were first married maybe a couple of months, and my grandpa worked in the mines. He took care of the horses, he trained the horses and cared for the horses that went down underground. And so he was headed off on his day, like for his day's work, and my granny fed him his breakfast and got him on his merry little way. And excuse me, his little lunch pail, his little tin lunch pail that he had even when I was a kid, which was kind of cool. Anyways, I'm digressing. And so she went about, she wanted to make him, her new hubby, she always called him her old man. She wanted to make her, and this is exactly how she said it. I wanted to make my old man a really good supper, really decent supper, and for when he came home from work that day. And so she went about her day. She got the fire going in the cook stove, and she got the bread going for supper. She was going to make a stew. So she got the bread going, and she put all the ingredients together, mixed all the ingredients together, and then she put it up to rise. And then she went about preparing the stew that she was going to make with the bread for supper that night. And so she got that all going, and she went back to punch the bread down again, and it didn't rise. And she was really worried about that. And this was about 9-10 o'clock in the day. And she'd started it really early because my grandpa went off to work fairly early, like 5 o'clock, I think she said. So anyways, she got this bread, came to punch it down the first time, and it didn't rise. So she put it back on the stove and she let it set for a little while longer. And she went back again, the stew's simmering on the stove, and she'd been doing other chores. And it still didn't rise. So she thought, oh no, what am I gonna do? And she said, well, I still have time to go and make another batch, but what do I do with this? I don't want the old guy, my old man, to see that I messed up and I wasted all these ingredients making this first batch of bread. And so my grandpa had this little knoll that he walked over to get on the path to the mine. And they were living in the housing that the people lived in for the mine, so they all kind of worked together, or walked to work together. And so anyway, she went on the top of this little knoll, and the dirt was nice and soft and fresh, and she dug a hole at the top of this little knoll off the path, and she buried the bread dough. And she went home and she finished making her bread. The second batch was perfect. It rose the way it was supposed to and did all that it was supposed to. And so she got that bread done, and she got it baked, and the stew was done, and she went about all her other chores. And she was having a really good day. And it was time for my grandpa to come home. And I'm not exactly sure what she was doing, but she was doing some chores and waiting for him to come home and get supper on the table for him. And it was pretty much ready to eat. And she could hear him whistling coming down the path. And he came in the door and he was laughing and asked her how her day was. And he was in a really good mood, and she was happy, and she was excited about her meal. And she said, "Oh, I had a great day. How was your day?" And he said, "Oh, my day was a really good day." And my grandpa had a really, really thick accent, and very often they would speak to each other in French. And I can just picture this whole story happening in my mind. And my grandpa asked her, "Did you bake bread today?" And my grandma's like, "Yeah, like it's turned out really good, you know, and we're gonna have it for supper with our stew." And he was laughing, and he said to her, "Are you sure it turned out okay? Are you sure that it's like ready to eat?" And my grandma says, "Yeah." And he's laughing, and he takes her by the hand, and he says, "Come here, I need to show you something." And so they're headed on the path up the hill back towards the mine, and my grandma was a little bit confused. And as she realized where he was taking her, she got really nervous and really worried. And when they got to the top of the little knoll where she had buried the bread, it had risen, and there was a big pile of loose dirt with a little poke of fresh risen bread sticking out of the hole. And she was mortified that, more than anything, that she had lied to him. They had just started out their life together, and she lied about something as silly as her loaf of bread not rising. But my grandpa was a really good sport about it, and he laughed, and it was a joke in our family to this day about her loaf of bread that rose in the hill. So, and he wasn't angry that she had wasted the ingredients or anything, and it all ended well. But it was a funny little story that's been passed down to all of us throughout a couple of generations. So my daughter actually did a speech about it at school. In grade 6, the school they went to had speech competitions, and she won counties with it. So she had everybody, the way she wrote it and presented it, she had everybody in the auditorium crying. So that was just a fun little ditty. And my meatballs are done, so you didn't have to watch me in silence. We've got this soup at a kind of a medium boil. And we're just gonna put the meatballs. We're just gonna gently drop the meatballs. This is gonna be a really meatball-y soup here. Got way more than 12. And we're just gonna let them simmer in here for half an hour. So now our soup has simmered for the time that it needed to be. I have got some pre-cut potatoes here that have been soaking in water so that they don't brown. All nice and clean, and I'm just gonna dump the whole thing in. We've got our potatoes, and we've got some celery that's gonna go in there as well. And now that is going to simmer, half covered, for 20 minutes. So now what we're gonna make is Bannock, but I grew up calling it baking powder biscuits. And Bannock is a very indigenous food. It was a staple in my house growing up. It was what my grandmother made all the time. It's probably the very first thing that I ever learned to make. And it definitely was one of the first things that my kids learned to make. And I mean, we put, you name it, we put it in there. Bacon, And I know that's not traditional Bannock, but gosh, bacon, cheese. We're gonna put some of those cranberries in it today. What else have we put in there? Oh, anything that's in the house, kind of. Raisins, whatever you can think of to put in it, we have put in it. And what you want is 4 tablespoons of a shortening. Now, my grandma used to use a lot of lard. She used bacon grease. She would use, in more modern times, she would use margarine, oils, like cooking oil, any kind of shortening. I've got 4 tablespoons of butter in here at the moment. Usually a tablespoon of salt, but I've just found lately, and this is just regular old table salt, I found I cut back the salt an awful lot, just especially if I'm using butter, because the butter's already salted. So I put about 1/4 teaspoon in there. And baking powder, and I'm gonna do 4 tablespoons of baking powder. 3, 4, and my flour, 2 cups of flour. So I put 4 teaspoons of baking powder, not tablespoons. I apologize for that. And 2 cups of flour. And you just kind of work it like a pastry dough. And I will add some liquid, and you can add milk. That was the go-to, milk and cream a lot of times. Again, whatever's in the house. I've used orange juice. It gives it kind of a neat little bit of a tangy taste. But today I'll probably just use water. And no measurement, just enough to make it into a dough. I might have to put a wee bit more butter. Just gonna squish my cranberries and throw in there before I put my moisture in. And I'm not going to put very many. Saskatoons is something that traditionally will go into this. Juniper berries, just a lot. Anything too that would be dried in that day. So the Saskatoons would often be dried. The cranberries, the blueberries, and that's probably the most common. And again, probably, I don't know, about 1/2 cup maybe of these. And I want to put these in before I have the water in, or the moisture in, just because they will give it a little bit more moisture. And again, these are just cranberries that I purchased just at the grocery store. If you dehydrate, or if you have fed or frozen, you can throw that in too. Okay, so I'm just gonna add a little bit of cold water, because warm water, of course, will make your baking powder rise. This is really yummy camping and cooking it on a hot dog stick over the fire or in a frying pan. And then it's called fry bread, but it's all pretty much the same recipe. And this is a really good trail food. in the old days, it could be made up ahead of time and stuck in cheesecloth or whatever, and it could go like on a horse very easily. Or I think that's the big reason why it gets used for camping so much, is because it's something that's quick and it's easy. And also, if they were to take the ingredients with them, you don't need a ton of ingredients. They could add their pemmican, I know often was added to this. And I think that's kind of where the bacon and the pieces of jerky, I know that my family, like my grandmother, would add into this recipe. I personally like the fruits. So apple, anything you have kicking around, try it. Try it. See what you can come up with. Now, the more you work this, the harder the biscuits will be. So try to get it mixed up as quickly as possible. And the other thing about this particular recipe is supposed to do about 8 biscuits, but my crew likes them big and light and fluffy. So this is, just tear it off. Squish it around like you wear your meatballs. And then we'll put it in the oven, which I forgot to preheat, for 400. And so you want to try to make them uniform, which I did not, unfortunately. And again, the more you play with them, the harder the dough will be. So if you can try not to mess around with them quite as much. I'm making this into one. Try to have them uniform. There. And then we will pop these in for 12 to 15 minutes. So we've got our baking powder / Bannock ready to go in the oven. We've set the oven to 400, and we're going to pop this in the oven for about 12 to 15 minutes, generally is what it takes. We'll peek in on them maybe about 10 minutes, and what we want to look for is for them to rise and for them to have a little bit of a golden brown top. So here we go. Our biscuits are almost finished, and this soup is ready to eat. And I'm just trying to take my little spice bag out here. You can get a grip on it. Probably tongs would have been easier. But you can see the loose leaf tea bag holds together pretty good. So, and yeah, that soup's ready to eat. All right. I added a couple more minutes, 3 more minutes to this, and I think they're done. They're not exactly brown on the top, but they definitely are on the bottom. So, and the biggest reason was because I didn't move the oven rack up. So, we are gonna have some soup and biscuits.